Hello there everybody, Sam's Trains here, welcome back to the railway and welcome to another review. Up today it's a very elegant tank engine from Bachmann. One of the very first locos I ever purchased was the Ivatt 2MT from Bachmann, and I just loved that model. I loved the design of the prototype and I loved the way the models looked. In fact, for a good time it was my favourite loco in the collection. And yet you probably haven't ever heard me mention this model before, which probably sounds a bit strange. But there's a really good reason for that, and that is that the loco failed catastrophically. It was an old split chassis locomotive, and the first thing that went wrong was the plastic spacers on the axles cracked and failed. And this frightened young Sam. He didn't know how to deal with it, but he opened up the loco and had a go. And actually he fixed it. He managed to glue the axles together and the loco worked again, for a time. Then the next thing that went wrong was the plastic discs on the wheels. They started to warp and bend and twist, and eventually they started to touch the coupling rods and the valve gear, and they fouled up the locomotive, and young Sam did not know how to fix that. And in fact, I don't know what happened to the loco chassis after that. I might have binned it or scrapped it or something. But I remember being really sad about that. I'd lost my favourite loco, effectively, but I didn't want to buy another one because I didn't know how to stop those failures from happening again. So I've never had a 2MT in the collection, at least not the tank, until today. So here is a new 2MT from Bachmann. And I understand that this is the same model that I owned all those years ago, or at least the body is the same, except Bachmann have redesigned the chassis, so fingers crossed this one now will not fail. So hopefully this has got a really nice modern and up-to-date chassis. But the body, as I understand it, dates back a lot of years, possibly even back to the 1990s. And if that's the case, and we'll have to look very carefully at this model to see whether it is, then the latest price from Bachmann for this loco seems absolutely ludicrous, because on Bachmann's website the RRP is listed as £164.95. Huh, for a body that dates back that far with a new chassis on it? Absolutely unbelievable. I mean, yes, they've redesigned the chassis, which is great. Hopefully it won't fail now, but then again, you know, this loco will not fail after 2 or 3 years. It's not exactly that much of a selling point, is it? But still, we'll have a close look at this. We'll figure out whether the body is as old as I think it is, or if it's got loads of detail on it, then I'll assume that it's been upgraded. And of course, I did not pay the RRP for this locomotive. I bought this one from Kerno for a slightly better price of £140.95. But really, that's still top dollar, isn't it, really? Particularly for a relatively small tank engine. But this is a loco I used to really love. I'm really excited to get it back in the collection again. And I'm hoping, really hoping, that this is a great chassis that runs well, so much better than the one I used to have. So let's investigate together. Here we go. So while I suspect that at least parts of this model date back possibly several decades, this particular example is brand new. I bought it new from Kerno, and if I remember correctly, this was part of the Bachmann 2021 range. So it's not as though I've purchased an old locomotive to complain about. Not that I'm anticipating any complaining, but at that sort of price, if this is the old outdated body that I know, I'm not going to be best pleased, but we'll find out in a little moment. Let me show you the end of the box then. So the product code for this loco is 31-442. It is an LMS Ivatt 2MT tank, number 1205, and it is in the LMS black. And the DCC socket on board is a nice modern next generation 18-pin one. And yep, this is in the LMS black, which I think is really nice. I think my old one was in the BR black, so that might make a nice change. Although of course it is quite a plain livery, so I've missed out on the sort of lining that the other versions might have, but hey, I'll just be glad to have one, full stop. Let me show you the back of the box then. So here is just a very, very brief history on this class in real life. It does include that only the first 10 were built by the LMS, which tells us, of course, that the model inside this box in real life was an early one built by the LMS. Right, shall we have a look? I'm interested to see what this is like. I'm really hoping for top performance from this chassis. In fact, well, it's got to be an all-rounder at that sort of price, but performance and longevity of the chassis, those are things that I'm really going to be looking at. Right, let's pop this out then. And I've noticed in the back of the box, there looks to be a nice modern set of instructions from Bachmann. So let's open up this leaflet and take a look. All right, the Ivatt Class 2 owner's information. So on the first page, we've got some info on fitting accessories, and blimey, there's a lot. It looks like we've got guard irons, steps, screw-link couplings, vacuum pipes. What else? Blimey. A little bit about running in, I'll always do that. Lubrication, shows you the lubrication points. Not sure why the brake rodding is highlighted there, but I guess it's nice to see what that is. Then inside we've got more lubrication. Okay, yeah, shows all the lube points, that's quite handy. We've got a bit about the internal chassis here, so we can see what looks like a more modern Bachmann motor here. Doesn't look like it's split chassis anymore, does it? Which is good, obviously. Circuit board there, perhaps that's where the DCC socket is. Yeah, that does seem to be the case. Bit about body removal on there as well. So yeah, it's all relatively straightforward, I think. And then on the back, DCC sound. Blimey, it doesn't even look as though this one has a pre-fitted speaker. Don't get me wrong, I'd rather models didn't come with pre-fitted speakers, because for those who are never going to use it, that's an expense that is a bit unnecessary, but at this sort of price, I kind of assumed it would have every possible feature. But yeah, maybe this isn't going to be a great value one. I do sort of suspect that, but you never know, do you? Oh, and by the way, look, inside the box, 21, so I was right, this being a 2021 model, possibly December 21, so not very old at all. Right, are you ready? Where are these accessories then? In the top. Right, let's have a look. So the brake rigging isn't pre-fitted because I can see it right here, so let's pull these out, have a look. So yeah, this looks like it's got everything that the instructions described. Brake rigging, steps, vacuum pipes. We do have some proper articulating screw-link couplings, which you can fit to the front and the back. Yes, there's two sets. And the guard irons are there as well. And obviously some of these parts, the steps, for example, might foul up the locomotive on certain curves and such, and that's why they haven't been fitted from the factory. Okay, shall we have a look then? Yeah, really interested to see what this is like. Let's open up the blister, have a look at the finish. All right, so old body or not, the finish on this example is noticeably way better than on the model that I remember so fondly. Yeah, you see that? You see the way the boiler is so shiny there? Yeah, and that really does look massively better than I remember. Okay, let's lift it up. All right, so the weight, I would say the weight seems pretty good. It's not knocking me over or anything, and I'm not having to use winches and pulleys to lift the damn thing up, but it does seem to be relatively heavy. But yeah, I do think, at least I suspect, that this is the original body for this loco. Maybe they've made some changes to it, maybe it's slightly more refined than the old one. I will have a look in a moment and see if I can find the original body that I had. But ultimately it doesn't look that refined, and that's before I've even taken a close look at this. It does seem as though the body is made of plastic, and that goes for the running plate as well at the front there. I'm not sensing any die cast with this. Yeah, they do feel like plastic to me. However, the chassis does seem to be quite a bit better. I think the wheels look a lot better than the ones I used to know, and the valve gear and coupling rods look, you know, they look fairly fine, I would say, don't they? So at the moment, it looks as though the improvements are solely in the chassis. But I don't know, it doesn't look bad, does it? It certainly doesn't look bad. And we'll take a much closer look at this model in just a second, but first of all, let's have some history on this class in real life. The Ivatt Class 2 tank was introduced to the LMS in 1946 for mixed traffic purposes. Production of the design continued until 1952, by which time 130 of the class had been constructed in total. As a result, most members of the class were actually built by BR, or British Railways. The engines were designed to be modern and efficient, complete with self-emptying ash pans and rocking grates, all intended to save time and therefore money. In terms of design, the 2MT utilised two outside cylinders and was heavily based on the Fowler/Stanier 262 tank engines. In service, most of the class served within the London Midland region, although the last batch were allocated to the southern region, making this class an interesting option for post-nationalisation southern region modellers. Withdrawal took place between 1962 and 1967, and to date only 4 remain under preservation. So there it is, up close and personal for you, the new, in inverted commas, Bachmann Ivatt 2MT. And for me, this one is a complete rip-off. The best thing about this, for me, is that it brings me nostalgia for the old version of this that I used to own. And at over £140, that's really not quite good enough, is it? This is the old body. I haven't been able to find the body from my old 2MT, but I did find some old video footage that I took of it back in 2015. And yeah, sure as buttons, it is the same thing, with some very slight improvements. For instance, this dome appears now to be separately fitted, whereas before it was really horribly moulded onto the body. So there might be some other things like that that I haven't noticed, but those improvements really don't matter when we've got a smokebox door that looks like this. Look at that wonky smokebox dart. It's a big, fat, chunky, separately fitted part that's all wonky and there's visible glue near it. Look how silly this outdated handrail looks. On the real thing, that's a really slim piece, and yet we've got massive, chunky holders with that. There's flashing all over the different detail parts. Look at this sort of strut coming out of the side of the smoke box there. Doesn't even connect with the rest of the body properly. It's covered in flashing. So is the top of the chimney. It just looks really, really bad and old-fashioned. Around the back, there's this really big chunky ladder that fits into massive locating holes. Look how big they are. It looks like one of my 3D printed projects, except when I 3D print a loco, it cost me about 25 quid and not 140. Look at these lamp irons. They're just bits of metal that stick out of the body and have been bent upwards. Really, really shoddy. And it irritates me that Bachmann upgraded the chassis. They redesigned the chassis and didn't retool the body. Why didn't they retool the whole thing? I really don't understand. In fact, that says a lot about Bachmann's attitude toward their customers, doesn't it, really? Because if they'd wanted to make the model better, they would have retooled the body as well as the chassis. Instead, it just looks like they wanted to make the model sellable again by making it DCC ready, and that's why they redid the chassis. And then to go ahead and slap an RRP of £164.95 onto this old bit of garbage is just downright disrespectful, in my opinion. And it's really annoying because there's so many people that say to me, you know, I'm going to have to give up this hobby because it's too expensive. I'm going to go and start fishing instead. That's so frustrating because this model will have been really cheap to produce. Bachmann could have sold this for much less than they are doing, and it would have made a great budget alternative to those people who can't afford the new tooled, super detailed models. And yet they would just rather rip people off with this really old model. It's shameful, unfortunately, and I'd hoped for so much more for my money here. Very, very disappointing. But there are some good aspects to this model, I suppose. The weight is pretty good now. It weighs in at 317 grams, which is actually more than a Bachmann 7F, including its tender. It's a little bit less than the Dapol Large Prairie, though, so I'd say the weight is more or less about right. Even though the bodywork and the detailing is old and outdated, the finish on this loco is much better than in the past. You can see a really nice satin sheen on the boiler here, which looks much better. And the decoration itself isn't that outdated, so you've got the running number and the classification on the side of the cab and the LMS lettering, but as an unlined locomotive, there's not very much in the way of complex decoration, which again calls that astronomical price tag into question. We do have the little builder's plates on here though, they look absolutely fine, and the buffer beams I suppose are relatively well painted, even though the level of detail on them is really not much to shout about. The detailing on the side of the loco is, well, it's present, isn't it? I think that's the only positive thing I can say about it. It looks really, really chunky and unrealistic, and all of the pipework and such, which should be visible on these components, is missing completely, let alone separately fitted or separately painted. Well, yeah, really, really shoddy level of detail. It does have some metal safety valves and whistles though, who'd have thought it? And that's not an upgrade. The old version that I used to have had metal parts there as well, so it's a little bit like putting lipstick on a pig, but at this point, we'll take it. Now, Bachmann have redesigned the chassis here, right? So I thought, what other upgrades might there be? Might they have added lights into the firebox door? Well, unfortunately that's impossible because there is no firebox door. Yeah, the cab floor is kind of right up towards the doors, so the whole lower portion of the cab just doesn't exist on this model. And my old Bachmann 2MT made this a little bit better by including some crew members that were inside the cab. This new model has nothing like that. So it's actually in some ways a downgrade from the ancient and outdated version that came before it. It really is just so disappointing. And we don't have any painted cab detail of any kind. In fact, the detail that is there looks like it's just moulded and quite chunky besides. Certainly not what you'd expect at this high price. We do have some glazing on the cab windows, which doesn't look good because the parts just are not a good fit into the window frames, as you can see there. No opening vent on top of the cab, that's just a moulded piece. The coal is quite large and unrealistic looking, and it's not removable, as you'd probably expect for a model of this age. The buffers are made of metal, but they are not sprung. Yeah, I'm not surprised, I do like sprung buffers. And the model will have been quite a bit cheaper to manufacture as a result of not having sprung buffers, and yet again, look at the price. The wheels though do look okay. We've got cast metal wheels now, which hopefully won't fail and warp and such. And as I mentioned earlier on, the coupling rods and the running gear all looks absolutely fine. Can't wait to see that up and running. And also look at the side of the cab here, look at the cab doors. Moulded handrails, really ineffective ones as well. They just look really flat, don't they? It's horrible, it's really just horrible. It would make a nice enough budget model, but at the price I paid, I'd just feel completely ripped off and really disappointed in it. And I can't see past that, unfortunately. If this had been £100 or less, then I would say, well done Bachmann, thank you for bringing a budget option to the market. But they haven't done that, so they don't get that applause. Okay, so there's a lot riding on the performance, shall we say that? Is that the understatement of the day? I think it is. So we'll get it down onto the track, we'll see how it runs, and then we'll take a look at the mechanism, and hopefully we will see £140 worth of goodness there. Well, let's call it £130 because we can call the bodywork here a tenner, can't we? So let's see what happens. Let's try to repress the psychotic rampage, shall we? So there she is, the Ivatt 2MT down onto the track, and the first performance test has already been filmed and it's in the can, so I'll show you that in just a second. Next, I went on and did my usual assessment of the mechanism, and generally speaking, this is a much better mechanism than on the old chassis. In fact, it's more or less perfect. So all of the loco driving wheels have pickups on them. The non-driven pony wheels don't, but that's pretty standard and fair enough. The base keeper plate is held to the loco using screws, no clips involved, which is good, and the electrical contacts are spring-loaded, which means you can pull the base keeper away and it's perfectly serviceable, also giving you full access to the bearings, which are separate brass ones. That's really good quality, love to see that. Obviously nothing like that on the old chassis. And we have the single-driven centre axle there, which again is nice and uncomplicated. Very good choice, I think. Removing the body is easy with just 2 screws, and it reveals this very heavy die-cast chassis where most of the loco's weight comes from. The motor here is a 5-pole motor, I believe, so that's great. Very glad to see a 5-pole and not a 3-pole motor here, although there is no flywheel fitted to the motor, which is a pity because there's plenty of space. It turns out the unrealistic cab floor is actually the DCC cover, which is removable to reveal the next generation 18-pin DCC socket into which you can place a decoder of your choice. It does just seem a strange place to have the decoder when there are plenty of other places for it to go. Yeah, it's a shame to compromise the cab detail in that way, but then again, detail on this locomotive clearly was not much of a consideration. Overall though, the chassis is a good design. It's lacking the extra features such as a flywheel and lights and such. I would certainly expect more for my money, but yeah, can't really fault it. And then the gauge is at 14.3mm back to back on each driving axle. Again, that is absolutely fine. So the mechanism is just about spot on, I would say. But how is the performance? Let me show you how that went. Alright, the time has come. There is quite a lot riding on this being a good performer. So let's find out whether that's the case. First question, does the loco work? I've set it forwards. Let's find out. Here we go. Alright, the answer is yes. It's quite noisy at the moment, but bear in mind it has not been running yet. And it just got jammed. Something literally just jammed up and it stalled. That did not sound good. The motor had power, but it couldn't move. We are not touching the controller there, so it keeps kind of jamming up. It might loosen off as time goes on. Let me look at it from the other side. Yeah, hopefully it's nothing serious, but it's limping along, isn't it? And don't forget, the performance here had to be absolutely faultless in order for this to be considered any good. Come on. Now, I know it hasn't been running yet, and there is room for this to improve with some running in, but it's not really crawling very well, and it does keep sort of starting and stopping. So at the moment, I'm actually quite annoyed by this now, because I was expecting the performance to be decent. At the moment, it isn't. How is the higher speed? Let's go at 50%. So I would say it's faster than expected. It's not unreasonably fast, I don't think. But yeah, quite nippy, I would say. Let's just, for the lols, let's just try a crawl, shall we? So I'm going to ease this up as gradually as possible, see what happens. Should say I haven't attempted any disassembly at this point, so nobody blame me, thank you. There we are, that's about as slow as we can go. Yeah, as you can see, it's just cogging. It jumps forwards in increments. It's not a smooth motion. Can't say I'm very surprised, given the low effort that we've seen in the model in other areas. Irritating. What a complete and utter rip-off. Bit better in reverse, maybe? Yeah. Almost acceptable in reverse. But it's not that useful. Most people run their locos forwards. So I think running in has got a lot of work to do, hasn't it? Yeah, will running in make this a decent loco? Well, let's find out. Forwards direction, let's see how it handles the track. So I'm going to say, when you consider what sort of loco this was in real life, and that this is only running at half power, yeah, I'm going to say that's a little fast. I think the gearing could have been better, particularly given how poor the performance was at the slow speed. So it's just not at all impressive, is it? I'm not going to draw any final conclusions yet until running in has concluded, but I will be very surprised if this transforms into a perfect performer over the next hour or so. I just don't see it happening, but it's going to have that chance. Fingers crossed, please. Let's hope for good performance. I don't think we're going to get it, but we can certainly hope. I'm going to go away and have a quick fume while this thing runs in. I will see you in just a second. Don't go anywhere. Okay, there we go. That is running in complete. And you know what? That did not go badly at all. I never saw it derail or stop or cut out, and I've not noticed it jam up again since that first time it did it. So that is fantastic. I do think it's a little bit too fast though. If anything, it has sped up during the running in period. Let me do another 50% run by. Bear with. Here we go. Yeah, it just seemed a bit nippy. I can't help thinking the low speed performance would have been a lot better if this had been geared down to run a bit more slowly. But how is the slow speed now? Let's find out. So I'm just going to turn this up gradually and we'll have a look. Now we know that this is a 5-pole motor. We can expect quite a bit from it. So, I don't know, it started off well and then it sort of took off and now it's cogging quite a lot. So, to be honest, given how expensive and undetailed this loco is, the performance isn't quite as impressive as it would need to be in order to make this loco any good. But it's not that bad, is it? And in fact, if I remember correctly, it was better in reverse. Yeah, that isn't bad. It's cogging quite a bit. It's not very smooth, but I would say it does seem a lot better than it was when I first tried it. Yeah, if not still perfectly smooth.
And that kind of makes sense because it does seem to have been geared to run quite fast, which is unusual for a mixed traffic loco of this sort. High speed really wouldn't be a priority, would it? And yeah, it's still speeding up and slowing down, yeah, as you can see. Very, yeah, I guess when the crank pins on this side reach about 10 or 11 o'clock, yeah, it clearly sort of seizes up a little bit, but it's not jamming like it was before, which is quite good. Okay, so the performance is okay. I would say it's about average, not that impressive. The pulling power, though, is very, very impressive. It came in at 0.46 newtons, which is around 28 coaches on straight and level track. It's not bad going for a small tank engine, is it? And so to test its pulling power, I've set up a load of these wagons, quite a bit of weight in these, because there's at least 20 odd, I would say. So let's get her coupled to them and see how she gets on with a load. Here we go, backwards. Let's try and do this steadily. Okay. At this speed, it does seem fairly smooth, so I have to say the performance is a lot better than I thought it was going to be. How was the coupling, though? Yeah, seems to be a successful one. I'll have to give it a little bit more power. I think we'll go for about 30 speed, because seriously, I think any faster than that, and it's verging on unrealistic for freight. So there's not a lot of power going to the loco. Will be interesting to see what the torque is like. On the middle line then, I've got another Ivatt 2MT, and it's also one by Bachmann, but of course this is, as you'll see in a second, the tender version of it. Now, this is a really old model. I think this came out sometime in the mid-2000s, and yet it is still far more modern and up-to-date than the loco I've just reviewed, which was released much more recently in 2021. So yeah, it just goes to show how shocking the 2MT tank from Bachmann has become, and the fact that they haven't addressed the issues with it is equally shocking, really, isn't it? And then on the inside line we have a Hornby 2MT, which dates back decades and decades, even further than the 2MT tank from Bachmann, and yet the level of detail's not really that much worse on this. It is worse, I mean, don't get me wrong, but not that much worse. And don't forget to see which other locos you can spot in the sidings. There is an odd one out today, and I will pin the first comment to correctly identify it. Now, how's this going to get on round the curve? Yeah, to say it's running on relatively low power there, the slowdown was not that noticeable. I detected, I would say, a very slight slowdown, but generally speaking, it seems the torque in this mechanism is fine. So that 5-pole motor has definitely done this loco proud. And I think from a distance, the loco looks lovely. That might just be nostalgia talking, because I used to have one of these many years ago, and obviously I really liked it, but I do think from a distance it is easier to forgive the shortcomings of this loco. But the same is true of the 1960s Triang steam locomotives, isn't it? And they don't cost £140 these days, at least most of them don't. So if the price had have been right, I could have recommended this to you, because it's a decent running loco that, you know, could have been purchased relatively inexpensively if it had been priced reasonably. But because it hasn't, I really wouldn't recommend picking one of these up unless you can find it at a heavily discounted price, which I so far haven't seen. I had to pay 140, and that really was the best price I could find at the time. So it's not one I can recommend. I think Bachmann really should have just retooled this one. They redeveloped the chassis, they should have just redeveloped the body and made it a decent model. Then, for £140, assuming it had all of the bells and whistles, it could have been a perfectly good model. But they didn't do that, and therefore I can't recommend it. But it's been fun, you know, I'm quite glad to have one of these back in the collection. I'm a bit sore that it cost me as much as it did, because I think my old one cost me about 30 quid or something. And to say this is pretty much the same thing, but just with a chassis that works, is quite insulting. But oh well, it's been fun. Let's have some ratings then for the Ivatt 2MT from Bachmann. Yeah, generally speaking, quite disappointing. It's a very, very expensive model given how old it is now. The level of detail I gave 2-star because really there's not much to be impressed with here. The finish and the decoration were both good, but that's the bare minimum at this sort of price. We've got a complete lack of decoration inside the cab, very minimal cab detail, no sprung buffers, visible moulding marks and flashing on different components.
Chunky details such as the smokebox dart, which had glue all over it by the way, very large scale handrails, and some poorly fitting parts. I mean, it's not good for how much it cost. Performance though is a lot better than it was when the Loco first started. It's not a brilliant performer now by any means. It does run quite fast and the crawl isn't excellent, which tells me that there's an issue with the gearing, but that issue with the wheel set locking up seems to have completely gone now that it's running, and there's definitely some decent torque in the mechanism because it's hauling those wagons without slowing down or anything, so the performance is much better than I thought it was going to be initially. The pulling power is quite phenomenal, 0.46 newtons or 28 coaches on straight and level track. That's more than a Hornby 9F, or even more than a Hornby Class 66 with rubber traction tyres. Yeah, the extra weight in this Loco and the high torque mechanism makes a really big difference, so it gets full marks on pulling power. The mechanism similarly is really good. Now, there's nothing special here about the mechanism, and I think there needed to be really for it to be worth the money, and that will be reflected in the value score, but you've got proper bearings, pickups on all the driving wheels, it's very serviceable, 5-pole motor, nice easy access to the DCC socket. It is missing the flywheel, so it can't get 5-star, but otherwise, yeah, the mechanism basically hits the spot. The quality though is just a 3-star for me because obviously quite a bit of visible glue on the model, even though it's a simple model. I don't know how they managed that. Visible flashing on different parts of the model, and the body is more or less entirely plastic with no die-cast boiler or running plate. At this price, again, that's quite unforgivable. And that leads us on to the value for money. The RRP of £164.95 is ludicrous, and so is the typical retailer price of £140.95. This model dates back decades, the chassis is better but unremarkable, and the level of detail is really lacking for this day and age, and so they can't give it any other than 1 star. It is a complete rip-off, I stand by that. Overall then, that is a score of 5.83 out of 10, and into the logbook it goes. Very close to the bottom, yeah, 45th place above the Hornby T Brown 040 and below the Bachmann Gandhi Dancer. Generally speaking, very disappointing.
Well folks, thank you so much for tuning in to this review. Yeah, it's been a while since I've been this badly ripped off by Bachmann, but there really is no other way to describe it, is there? Anyway, if you've got thoughts on this model, please do comment down below. Everything in this video is of course just my opinion, so if you think I have been harsh, please tell me so. Yeah, if you think this Loco deserves a kinder review, then tell me why. I'd be interested to hear. But that was my review. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with some more Locos, hopefully ones that are a little bit better than this. Alright, cheers folks, you take care.